Hello, Taylor Elwood here, and welcome to the Magical Experiments podcast. This week I thought I would talk about the process of releasing grief. This is a topic that is personal for me because recently, at the end of January, I lost my cat Onyx. I had to put him to sleep. He had a spinal lymphoma. And what was so heartbreaking about the situation is that he wasn't even 2 years old. It wasn't like he had lived a long and full life. It was that he hadn't even lived 2 years. And don't get me wrong, losing a cat or a dog or a pet at any time is hard. I want to be very clear about that because I've lost cats that have lived for a long time. But losing him before he was even 2 years old was in some ways harder because it wasn't expected at all. I initially thought that the issue was behavioral, that he was upset that I wasn't home as much. And I'm sure there was some of that, but it became very, very clear that there was something else wrong. And when I found out that it was because he basically had spine cancer, I had to make a really tough choice. I could keep him around for a little while longer, knowing that he was in pain and, trying to do the best to manage that pain, or I could give him the gift of releasing him from this life. I knew that if I kept him around, I would be dealing with him in pain and miserable. I could already see that his quality of life was diminishing. He was getting thinner. He also was, didn't like being touched in certain spots. And it really just broke my heart. So I did the right thing. I put him to sleep. And afterwards, I brought him home to bury him. And while I was doing that, my beloved did a ritual on the phone. She got on the phone with me because we are currently living long distance from each other. And she did a ritual for me to help me with the process of grief. And I'd like to say that ritual in and of itself was enough to just release the grief, but of course it wasn't. It was a start. But I had a process, a journey to go on. And what hit me was that recently I was getting ready to go away on a trip. And I've been traveling a fair amount recently. And I have another cat, Obsidian. And before I left, I found myself getting irritable and upset and everything else. And then it finally dawned on me, and it was the day of the trip. I'd already left. I'm like, I was sharing this with my beloved. I'm like, I'm upset because Obsidian's alone. And it made me grieve Onyx all over again because I'm like, Onyx isn't there. So they're not taking care of each other. And Obsidian Obsidian is dealing with him being gone, and I'm not there to take care of him. And that hit hard. That was not a good feeling. It made me feel alone in that moment, even though I really wasn't. I was just sad and upset, but I allowed myself to have that grief, to release it and process it and acknowledge it. And after I got back from the trip, I ended up getting a new cat, Garnet, who I'm happy to say is keeping good company for Obsidian, and that makes me feel, that just relieves a burden on my heart that he's not going to be alone, and that he has a companion, and he seems to have calmed down a bit since that, so that's good. But it got me thinking about the magic of releasing grief. The thing is that in our society, we're really not taught how to handle grief. If you feel sad, you're supposed to bury it. I see this with men all the time, and like in the men's work that I do, where men push down their grief and don't acknowledge it because they're not supposed to feel grief. But I see it with people in general. Oh, we're not supposed to acknowledge grief. We're supposed to get over it as quickly as we possibly can, and that's just not realistic. One of the books I wrote, Inner Alchemy of Wintering, actually explores that need for grief, that need to allow ourselves to go still and to be and to just process and be in the experience. And it is such a formative power that we need to have. We need to be able to grieve. How do we do that? I think the first thing is just accepting that grief has its own season. I mean, we can call it wintering. We can call it whatever we want. I call it wintering because I think that winter is a time of slowness and stillness, of rest and regeneration. And part of that sometimes is allowing ourselves to be in presence, in awareness with the experiences that we are not wanting to process otherwise, but that we know we need to. When those experiences get pushed down and layered down below, they're there still. It's not like they're not. And they're inevitably going to come up. And when they do, they come up in a way where it's kind of like, hey, I need you to know that I'm here. And that's part of this power of grief that we otherwise ignore at our own peril. One of the things that I really sit with is like, how do we release that grief? How do we honor and acknowledge it? And part of it is that we create specific practices, specific rituals around grief. And these rituals aren't limited to a season out of the year. I mean, I talked about wintering, but really you can experience wintering at any time in your life. When I got a divorce, it was spring turning into summer, and I was wintering after that. When I broke up with two different people in recent years, it was during the summertime, and I was wintering each of those times. So it's not that, oh, okay, when it's cold out, that's when wintering happens. Like right now, I'm actually experiencing, I would say, a spring in my life where I'm just experiencing all the budding potential of things, and the creativity being released, and of course the flourishing of new love. And there's still some wintering because I'm also processing Onyx's death and allowing myself to just be fully present and mindful with that death. I'm recognizing that what I'm grieving is yes, the loss of his life, but also the grief that I have around all the losses of all the cats that I've had over the years. It's interesting because I think that our relationship with grief is kind of like around the idea like we should, if we can somehow get over it, that we can just let it go and move on, and that it'll just be gone. But that's not real. And there's a saying in the pagan occult community that what is remembered lives. And that's true. What we remember lives on with us. And it doesn't have to live on in a way where like there's sadness all the time. I mean, I can easily think of some good moments that I had with Onyx, and it brings a smile to my face, and it makes me happy to know that I had those times with him. And I can easily think of the moment when he died, and how that felt, and be able to hold space with the grief that I was feeling at that time. So when we come up with practices around grief, I want to be very clear that even though the title of this podcast is Releasing Grief, this isn't about moving on from grief. It's not trying to get past grief as quickly as possible. What I want to encourage any and all of you to do is to actually be really present with your grief as a signal, as a presencing of who and what you are, and how you show up in the world around you. Being present in the fullness of your sadness, being present in the fullness of this moment where things have not worked out. Where there is a loss. And grief doesn't occur just with the death of a pet or a loved one or a friend. I mean, yes, definitely those are examples, but like grief can occur like when you leave a job where you were close friends with somebody, or you really love that job and it just didn't work out. Grief can occur with a relationship. Like when you break up with somebody, that is a moment where there is grief there on both people's ends. Even if you end up somehow working it out so that you're friends, which can happen, there's still going to be grief for what was, even as there can be an embracing of what's new. And so, one of the things that I think is really important is that we actively encourage this process of grief. And it's not about getting to a result of like, oh, the grief is gone. It's about giving ourselves the space to fully process and allow in the lessons, the experiences of the grief, and just the simple sadness. I mean, there doesn't even have to be a lesson. It can just be, I am sad and I'm allowed to feel this grief. I waited a few weeks to get the new cat, Garnet. And honestly, I wasn't even sure I was going to get a cat. It really boiled down to the fact that I realized, one, I didn't like leaving Obsidian home alone without another living presence there for when I'm gone. But the other part of it was I realized like he was really needy for attention. And I realized that that was his way of saying I'm grieving too. And it's not that I think the other cat is automatically going to quote unquote cover the wound of losing Onyx. I don't think that at all. It's just that I think that having that companionship may help ease that grief. Now, I can't tell you for sure how a cat grieves or doesn't grieve. I mean, I've just kind of watched him get more needy for attention and recognize that, like, when Onyx was there, he wasn't as needy. There was, not that he didn't want attention, he did, but that he had that companionship. What I can say is that when we don't when we don't allow for grief, we also don't allow for recognizing like what we need to do to help us process that grief. In his particular case, and in my case too, in all honesty, having Garnet is a part of that process of healing. I didn't want to get another cat because I honestly did not want to experience the potential of losing yet another beloved pet. Getting attached to another pet and then losing that pet, losing that cat, and then holding that grief again. Like that was like, no, I don't want to do that. And then I realized like that's not really that's just me avoiding the grief. That's not allowing me to be fully present with the grief. Part of the process of being present with the grief is accepting that yes, there are times where we are going to lose people. We're going to lose pets. We're going to lose other things. Like nothing lasts forever. There's that one saying, no one gets out alive. It's true. Someday I will pass on. And there will be grief. There will be people who will be sad and upset when I'm gone. Just like I will be sad and upset when people in my life are gone. I mean, even now I find myself thinking about my dad. It's not every day now, but it's still a fair amount. He died in 2019. And there is still a sense of grief. There's also a sense of a continuing relationship with him. What grief allows us to do is it allows us to acknowledge the loss of the physical presence of the person, but it also reminds us that we still have an ongoing relationship with the person. We have an ongoing relationship with some. Now we don't always necessarily want an ongoing relationship. Like when you break up with somebody, at some point you just want to be able to move on. And you might be friends with that person, but if you're not, you want to be able to move on. And that is an important thing. Like I don't have an ongoing relationship with the people that I've broken up with for the most part, or broken up with me. We've moved on from each other. We had our respective experiences of grief, of anger, of whatever else. And we've moved on. Well, I can't speak for them, but I can say I've moved on. And in that moving on process, there has been a component and an understanding of, yeah, there is some grief here. And that grief has actually helped me to move on. The expression of it, the allowance of it, the beingness with it. We need our grief because our grief grounds us and helps us to be present with who and what we are. And also with the changes of identity. So today, I want to encourage you to explore, how do you do grief rituals? Like, what do you do? And I'll give you an example of a grief ritual that I've done, it was actually with a breakup. I took all the notes and all the physical notes that were written, and I put them into a brazier and I lit them on fire. And then I scattered the ashes. And in that process, I expressed my anger over the breakup, but also my grief over what was lost, over the potential of a life together, over all the other things. For me, this was it was a very powerful experience. I called in the directions. I called in the sphere of art. I I did the ritual where I basically just said, like, I am releasing this person's energy from my life. I am cutting this cord. I am releasing this. And I even symbolically cut a cord. And then I lit everything on fire. And I took it over to the crossroads at my house and scattered it. And that was a beginning. Did I suddenly get over that person? No. I mean, that person had literally moved out that day. Was I suddenly over everything and having everything fixed? No. I still had an experience of grief to work through. I still had a process of sadness and all the other things. And yet it started the process. What I think I would encourage for all of you is to welcome the idea that you can have multiple rituals of grief and multiple experiences of grief around something. And that all of it is a part of the process of releasing the grief, of allowing it to go through us and to become clean with what's there. And there are going to be multiple moments, and those moments are sometimes also an opportunity for reflection. Like, part of it for me around that grief was also taking ownership of where I'd gone wrong, where I'd done some things that I could have handled them better. I could have shown up in a different way. And not just for that person, it was also about showing up for me. Part of the grief process was I'm grieving for myself. So often when we think of grief, we think I'm grieving for this other person. I'm grieving for the cat. I'm grieving for the relationship or whatever else. And yes, that's true. And yet it's also I'm grieving for me. I'm grieving for my loss. I'm grieving for the realizations that I've had. I'm grieving for the areas where I need to grow. Even though that, like, I need that growth, there is also that part of, oh, I'm feeling this sadness and this pain around the growth that I need to do. And can we just normalize and accept that that's actually a very real way to feel? And that it's actually the healthiest thing we could do? Because I think if we can embrace that we are allowing ourselves to grow through the grief. And that is one of the most important things that we could do. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. And if you want some more practical help and information around how to process and work through grief, I invite you to check out my course, Inner Alchemy of Wintering, where I walk you through some grief practices, some wintering practices. This is good for also recovering from burnout, and other things along those lines. And there are some great practical exercises in that course. There's details below, and I'm offering it at a special discount for the next couple of days. So check it out. And if it's something that's helpful to you, sign up for it. Thank you so much. And please share, comment, restack, and have a great day.